called Skill in Norway. So we focus on all the product stacks from Microsoft and heavily on the cloud. So we have people working with Power Platform. We have people working with Azure as a data center. We have security. We have the mobility endpoint management story. So we have a lot of things, and I'm quite all over the place actually. My MVP status is enterprise mobility, so I focus heavily on identity and access management, and that brings the Azure AD in quite something I work with on a daily basis. But also I find it very intriguing to mix Azure AD, identity access management with all the other scenarios, because when you have your data center or Power Platform or anything in the cloud, you need to protect it, and then you have a lot of great possibilities with Azure AD. So that's the behind story of this session. I would really like you to connect with me. You see on the bottom of the screen there my Twitter and LinkedIn and GitHub. You will find me easily at Jan Vidar Elven, and I also blog at gotoguy.blog, so you can find me there. So please connect if you want to, and refer to that you're looking at this session, for example, and I will happily accept. So a little backstory. This is a famous quote from Confucius, a Chinese quote about learning. And this is very interesting, because if you listen along to my session today, you will hear the stuff I talk about, and you probably over time you will forget it. Something I might say can make an impact, and you will remember it for a little longer. But basically, if you only hear this session, you will forget what I'm talking about in a while. I will show some demos, and then you will maybe have a better equipped to remember what I'm showing you. But the one thing I want to encourage you to do is to do this yourself, because then you will understand, and then you will truly learn. And that has been my journey about serverless, like logic apps and Azure Functions, and protecting with Azure AD as well, because I have had some ideas on how it would work, but I really needed to do it myself to really understand what's going on and the possibilities. So that's the encouraging quote to start with. So let's get the basics straight. That's important, because we need to have an understanding of how Microsoft Identity Platform will work for authentication and authorization. And enter the concepts of Microsoft Identity Platform using OAuth 2 and OpenID Connect. These are standards. You can use them in a lot of different kinds of scenarios, and it could be other identity providers as well. But the basics of this authentication and authorization is these four main components. So you have the identity platform, which will be Azure AD in our case. This function as the authorization server. So that's the main component. And on the other end, we have the resource owner. The resource owner is really the end user. That's you. You are the one that wants to access something, and then you need to authenticate and authorize. And then we have the resource server. That's the API. That's the thing you want to access. Many of us are using, for example, Microsoft Graph as an API. So the resource server will be a kind of a ready-made API. You can also use the Azure REST API, Key Vault API. There are a lot of interesting APIs you can just start using in Azure. But you can also have your custom APIs, which we'll get to in this session. And then we have the OAuth client. And the OAuth client is the authentication endpoint for the users or for applications that access resources on themselves. So the OAuth client, that's the kind of the native client or a web application. It could be the Power Platform flow. It could be a Power Automate flow. It could be a Power App. So the client is really where your end users will access the API. That's all where all the authentication and authorization magic is going on. And on the middle of the picture, I have a bearer token. And the token, I will get to that later, but the token is very important because that will tell us what kind of information can the user via the client access from the API. And all this is facilitated by the identity platform endpoint. So bringing on a few other information here on this page. So let's think of the resource server as our custom APIs, which we will expose via a logic app or, for example, Azure function. So you will have some kind of a API naming. So you can call this whatever you want. I will show you that in the demo later. But this will be the kind of the audience. This is the API we will access. And the client, it could be, for example, using Power Platform. You could easily create a web page. You can create a single page application with Java script. You can create a mobile application, or you can use CLI management tools like PowerShell or Azure CLI or something also to access that information. So there are a lot of different client variations, but for example, these could be easily seen as a Power Platform components. So that's the basis of identity platform in this case. And why do we want to protect serverless solutions? Well, serverless solutions, they use triggers. So there are a lot of inbound, built-in triggers in serverless solutions. You have events, something can happen when something changes. You can have timer schedules, queue, and so on. And if you're using logic apps, you have connectors, and they also have trigger actions. So you can trigger the logic app when something happens with the trigger connector. But what I really want to focus on now is HTTP request triggers, because these are the manual triggers. These are the triggers you trigger when you need to, either via an application, via something you do in the Power Automate flow, or something you do in Power Apps, or something. So then you request an HTTP to the serverless function or a logic app. So in this case, we will let the serverless be an API. So we can expose the serverless solution as an API via the HTTP calls. There are a lot of default protection mechanisms with serverless. You can use API keys like function keys, for example, if you're using Azure Functions, or you have shared access signature protections with logic apps. You can also apply IP restrictions, for example, firewall restrictions that only people coming from certain IPs can trigger those solutions. So you have some possibilities for protecting your serverless functions. But bringing us to the topic today, I want to show how we can use Azure AD OAuth 2 to provide that authentication and authorization, and then we will use that as a protection for the serverless. And the great thing about this is that then we can use the powers of Azure AD. So when we create an application registration that will represent the client, then we also get an enterprise app, which we can set requirements for. So we can, for example, set that, okay, everyone that wants to trigger my custom API in Logic App or function apps, they need to have an MFA in their authentication claim. Or we have some conditional access rules. So we can apply all the conditional access policies that we could think of, like risk-based, required devices to be compliant, location-based, and so on. So this brings a really interesting scenario against protection, and we can also do normal user and group assignments. So only certain people can call the HTTP request trigger, for example. So if you want to work with this, you need to understand the token. So the token is based on the standards, OAuth 2 and OpenID Connect. The OpenID Connect standard will be the basis for the verification of the identity. That's the user that calls the identity platform, and will produce an ID token that represent you. The tokens, it can be implemented differently. Most identity platforms will produce identity tokens, ID tokens, and access tokens that are formatted as JSON web tokens. They are base 64 encoded, so you can decode them and read them, but they are protected in transit. Some implementation of OAuth use simpler formats for JSON web tokens, but the major providers and Azure AD, of course, they provide JSON web tokens. So there's a difference between the ID token and access token. The ID token, that represent you as the user using a client to authenticate against the identity platform, and will show which user has authenticated and get successful authentication, while the access token is used for authorization. So the authorization and the access tokens is meant for the API. The audience is the API. So while the ID token is used for authenticating and showing that you have successfully authenticated with identity platform, you should never use the ID token to do something authorization based inside your serverless API, for example. Then you will need to use the access token. So the access token audience, you will configure that via app registration in Azure AD. So a few words about API permissions as well. So we have delegated permissions. They run as on behalf of a logged in user. So you're running this as yourselves. And in the token, delegated permissions will be shown as scopes. Those scopes are in a string claim, and they are comma separated. Scopes can be user consented by user or admins, and some scopes you can require to be consented by admin. If you have been working with, for example, Microsoft Graph and permissions there, you will see that some permissions are user consents and some require admin consent. And we can use that same logic in our custom APIs. So, for example, in a sample token here, I have a SCP, that's the scope claim, and I have another an example here on managed devices read, for example. That's a scope that in this token. And application permissions. This is when the application run as themselves. It won't require a logged in user, so it's perfect for automation scenarios, things that will run either if a user is logged on or not. And for authorization, we will need to use the roles claim. And the roles claim is a little bit different from scopes. It's an array, so it's a multi-value claim. And application permissions can only be admin consented. It's not possible for users to consent to that, but that makes sense because application permissions are only for applications. So in a token, you will see that, for example, you have roles, and you will have one or more roles to that in that token. For example, in this case, I have something called managed devices role read and managed devices role read all. And you can combine the two. So even though if you want to use the logged in users, you can have the users to use scopes, but you can also assign the roles to users. So you can give a user the role to be able to read all managed devices, for example. So you can combine the two also. So that's an important part of why we do this and what's the formats and the things we need to think about. Now we can go into the scenario, which we will focus this presentation on, and that is the custom API that will expose our serverless. So first of all the magic, it happens in Azure AD, and it happens in the app registrations. So when you create an app registration, the first thing you will want to do if you want to expose an API is that you go to that section, expose an API, and then you will set an application ID URI. it will automatically recommend that the API will have something called API : and the application ID. The client ID will normally stay here. But you can type anything you want. You can type, for example, in my case, I have created my own custom API, and I will call this Elven Logic App API, for example. So you can create anything you want. It needs to be unique inside your organization. And then you can create the scopes. So, for example, for each scope, you can see that, for example, I want to have a scope called Manage Devices Read, and both admins and users can consent to that. And I can have some display names and more explaining from what the user will see when they have the consent dialog. And I can have some more advanced scopes, like being able to read all devices. And in this case, I only want admins to be able to consent to that, for example. So this is the way you start. And this is before I even go into the Azure Functions or the Logic app. You just create an app registration that will represent your custom API. You can also add app roles, which I had in my previous slide. I showed you the difference between delegated permissions and application permissions. So if you go into app roles, and this is in preview now, before you needed to go into the manifest and manually configure app roles, but now you can do it in the GUI. So you can add app roles, and this in this way you can also add different kinds of roles that you will apply to your authorization logic. So I have a role for reading devices and also reading all the devices. Great. And then you need to do something in the next step, and that is to represent the client. So what I'm in reality showing here, and I will just just go back to the first picture just to have the overview. So the first app registration I showed you now, this is in this box. It will represent my custom API towards an Azure function or logic app or something. So that's the first app registration. But now I need to create app registrations for the clients. So I need to provide a way for clients to be able to authenticate with the identity platform and then get an access token that will be used against the API. So going back to this one, here we are. So this is a new app registration, and I will go into that app registration. I will call it, for example, Logic App Client, and I will go into app permissions, API permissions, and I will add my custom API and the different permissions I want to ask for. So this lets my users be able to ask for these scopes when they authenticate. And if I want to do an application client, for example, an application that will run on its own without requiring a logged-in user, I can add application permissions. And these are the role permissions I showed, which are defined in the API. So I will use either of type application or, as you see here, delegated permissions based on what's available in the API. So the strategy, and this is what the way I want to recommend you to do this, is that you build an API app registration with all the kind of scopes and roles you need, and then you can have different clients that will use just the permissions they need from that API. So in your custom API, you can have you can have 10, 20, 30 different kinds of scopes or roles. But in the clients, this is where you let your users authenticate or your application authenticate, and then you will just add in the permissions you need. So you can have different scenarios, for example, supporting different cases. Finally, time for some demo. Let's show this in a little practice. So if I go into, and I can go to Azure Active Directory. And I will go to app registrations. So I have created a new API for this session only. Let's see, I will just search for it. I have created an API called Elven User Auth Methods API. The reason I want to create this API is that I want to do some logic in a function app that will get people's authentication methods, like have they set up MFA based on their phone, Windows Hello, FIDO2, for example. And that in that case, I will get that from Graph. But this is my custom API, and I will show you what kind of API permissions I have defined here. So on Exposed API, I have created some custom scopes, like be able to read phones, or be able to read FIDO2 keys, or Microsoft Authenticator, or password methods, or email methods, or Windows Hello, and so on. I also have a default scope called user impersonation. So these are my own permissions. I have just made these up. Basically based on my custom API, which I've named as API Elven User Auth Methods. The reason I wanted to do this is that if you go to Microsoft Graph, and Microsoft Graph, they have Authentication Methods API. So you can access those methods directly via the graph. You don't need to build a custom API in reality. But as you can see, if you have, there's one API and one permission set in Graph, but the same permission is used for getting password methods, phone methods, FIDO2 methods, and so on and so on. Even now, just in preview, we have temporary access pass. Finally, a new function that will let us set up a one-time access key for users that need to bypass MFA. So there are different methods here, but if I go into each one of them, for example, phone authentication method, they will, let's see here, if I get like get, you see some details on how this will work. And let's see, I just wanted to show you, yeah, these are the permissions. So Graph, they have two types of permissions. They have user authentication method read, and they have user authentication method read write. So basically, using Graph, you can only have one permission, and if you have that permission, then you can read all methods. In some organizations I work in, phone numbers are sensitive information. People need to hide their phone numbers of different reasons. They can have a secret phone number. They are not listed in any phone book or something. And you really don't want to expose phone to people that really don't need that access. So if I wanted to do something about that, I could do just this thing here. I could just add phone read to some scopes that only require it, and other could read all the methods, for example. So I can break down in different permissions, custom permissions. And this is the thinking behind this app registration here. So that's how I expose scopes. And if I go to app roles, you will see that I have created some app roles as well. So I have created the possibility to read all hello methods, email methods, authenticator methods, and so on. So I have this in an application scenario as well. So if I wanted to create a new scope, I will go to Expose API and add scope. And I will have a scope name. And one of the things that's new, if I had it, go back to this page here, you will see that there's something called temporary access pass. So let's represent that. So I can type, for example, temporary access pass read. And I will only let admins be able to consent to that, because this is kind of little sensitive information. And then I can say some consent display name, read users temporary access pass, and allows the app to read users temporary access pass, for example. And then I can enable this scope. So now I have a new scope permission here. I can also do the same for app roles. So for example, if I go create an app role, and I can say read all temporary pass. And then I need to decide what kind of members can be in this role. Only applications, just for application scenario permissions, or could I use both users and groups and applications? And that makes sense, because if I want to assign this role to a user or to a group, I can also let that be possible by selecting both users and groups and applications, but you can decide. So if I call this a temporary access pass read all, can read all users access pass, like this. So then I have a new app role as well. So going back, and this is the next thing I was talking about. Then I need to provide some authentication platform for either users or applications, or a combination of the two. So if I go to Auth Methods Client user, and then go to API permission, and if you have been working with API app registrations before, you might have been sitting here and adding Microsoft Graph permissions. But you can also go add permission, and you can go, let's see, go to not one of the commonly used APIs, but you can go to my APIs. And you can see that I have Elven use Auth Methods API. So this is my custom API. And then I can select delegated permissions. And you can see all the permissions I have already added, but now I will add the new permission. So I can ask for that as well. So basically, when I use clients like user permissions and delegated, I don't normally do grant admin's consent on behalf of all my users. And the reason is that I want users to be able to grant that consent themselves. As long as it's not admin consent required, you can let users decide that for themselves. And note that the temporary access pass, I said that this needed admin consent, so you can see that it's not granted there. So I don't want to grant that on behalf of all my users. I will let users do that themselves. Likewise, I can go to the other app registration that represent the application client. And I can go and add API permissions here as well. So, and I will add the permission. And in this case, I will also use my API, but now I will use application permissions. And now I can add, for example, the temporary access pass read all and add that. So, and then you can see that this has been added, but application permissions, they do need that you grant admin consent, because if not, they will not be added to the permissions in the scope or in the token, roles in the token. So I need to do this in application scenarios. And this is also a reason that you won't, I recommend that you don't mix application permissions and use delegated permissions in the same app registration. Because if you're using application, then you need to grant admin consent, and then you will admin consent to all of the permissions. There are some ways you can do separate consents, but then you need to build a consent URL or something. So basically, I would recommend that you separate application permissions and delegate it in different app registrations. So far, we have now built an API. That API contains some scopes and roles that I can use for authentication and authorization, mostly for authorization. And I have provided some clients here that I can use to actually get the access token. So let's try to see this in action. So first of all, I will go to the client and user. And you can see I have an application client here. So I will copy that. And then I will go to Postman. And in Postman, you have great built-in support for OAuth and accessing APIs, of course. So for the client ID, I will add that ID for that app registration. The tenant is my tenant. So I already have that in place. And then I need a client secret. So I will go to certificates and secrets, and I will create a new client secret. And let's call this Global Automation Bootcamp. And I will add that secret. And then I need to copy that secret before it disappears. And then I can go here and add that. So I'm not sure if you are familiar with Postman, but I have created a collection here, an environment of variables that I can reuse. So let's save that. And then I can go and go to my folder here. I will call it Azure Functions, and I can go and take on the authorization. I can go and select OAuth 2. So in this case, I will have some basic parameters for adding the authorization data automatically to request headers. I have some different tests from before, so I will not show them here. But the most important part is this thing under here. So I can configure a new token. I will just call it, this is just a reference name. So I will call it Serverless API token. And then in OAuth, I have some authorization, different kinds of grants, like authorization code is the normal one to use for end users and delegated scenarios. And then I will need to add this callback URL here. So let's copy that. Because this is the Postman client. So when I go to this app registration here to authenticate, I need to be able to add a platform. And if I go and add a web platform here and add the Postman callback URL like this, it will accept authentication requests from my Postman client. I don't need to configure anything else here now. So this is just for letting a Postman be able to request my access token. So then I need to provide the authorization URL. That's the login microsoftonline.com, the tenant ID, which is
Have we lost Jan? Maybe there's a snowstorm. Just give Jan a few seconds. He may have lost his connection temporarily. Things are all going so well.
Hey, hopefully I'm back again.
Thank you, Jan. Yes, thank you for realizing. We only lost you for about, less than a minute, really. So we didn't really miss much. So,
Yeah,
thanks for that.
I was immediately notified myself. So I was notified that my phone needed a little refresh. Sorry about that. But if you can see my screen now and you can see and hear me, then we're good to continue. Yeah.
Thanks, Jan.
Yeah. So we were at the point where we added the Postman, and then we can add the callback, and I will use that in my Postman environment here, where I have the authorization and access token URLs. So I will use the tenant ID parameters, and then I will use the client ID and the secret I have already copied in to my environment variables. And so let's try to just access get a new access token now. So when I click that, it will prompt my browser and let me be able to authenticate to my API. And immediately I got notified that I need to have a parameter called scope. Of course, I need to have a scope. So let's go and cancel that. I need to have a scope here because you need to specify a scope. So if I type, for example, user read, I will get an access token with the scope user read, but that will only be for the Microsoft Graph API. I need to specify my custom API. So for example, when I go to, let's go here and go to my API again, I need to specify this scope, this API, and the scopes I want to have inside my application. So for example, if I want to use phone read, then I will ask for phone read like this. So API Elven user auth methods, that's the name of my API, and phone read. You can use API colon, or you can use HTTPS as well. It's all depending on what you have in your app registration. Let's try again. So switching to my client and get new access token. And now you can see that it asks me to log in because I'm running this as on behalf of myself. And now it will say, hey, let's read the phone methods for using Elven user auth methods, view your basic profile, and maintain. This is the basic OpenID permissions. The really interesting thing is read phone methods, which I can now click accept on. And it should get the token. It couldn't successfully authenticate, so let's do it one more time. This is the demo scenario. So basically here, let's see if I have all the information correct. Did I save this? I'm not sure if I do that. Let's try one more time. Yeah, this is the correct one, I think. So authenticated call, then I got authentication complete. And if I now look into here, I can see that I have got a token. Perfect. So now I can copy that token and let's look at that. And if I click use token, it will also provide it in the access token and bearer header for any subsequent requests. So if I go now to, for example, a JVT debugger, like you can use JVT MS, which is Microsoft's provider, and you can paste the token here, and then you can see that I have now been given an access token that represents me my logged in user with the scope phone read. So now I have a correct token, and the audience, this key value here, that's the application ID of, so it starts with C90. This is the application ID of the API. You can see it here, application client ID C90. So I have now retrieved an access token for that endpoint, that audience. And then now I can use that for any other scenarios as well. So if I want to have different scopes in my environment, I can go and add with space between them. So I can have, for example, you remember I had a tempo access pass. Let's ask for that. And because I added admin consent only for a temporary access pass, I will need to have an admin to consent to that. So that's working as expected. So end users are not able to get the scope for access pass read, for example, if not an admin has consented. So let's just kill that one. Going back to the presentation, and we will see into more usable scenarios. Oh, there's one more thing I want to show in this demo. Sorry. If I click here. So now I've been using what's called the authorization code flow. It will use scopes and it will use my personal logged in user delegated permissions. If I do the client credentials flow, then I can authenticate with a client ID and client secret, and I can ask for all the application scopes. So let's start with that. Because when you are using client credentials, then you will always use the, it's a dot there, dot default as the scope. Because you cannot really ask for different personal or custom scopes when using application permissions. And then I will need the client ID and client secret. So if I go back to my app registrations and the application, and this in this example, I will go to the Elven user auth methods client app. This is where I have prepared the application permissions. So I need to have this application ID, client ID. So I need to change that. So I will just manually do it here, so I don't change my environment. So I will do the client ID, and I need to create a secret also in here, because the other secret I had, it was in the user-based client app registration. We'll do like this, and copy that. And I can paste this instead of that value. So using the client credentials flow, I can just click on get new access token, and there will be no user prompts, because now my client is just authenticating as itself. So I can click on use token here, and now I have a new token I can copy, and I can look at that in the JVT debugger. And now you can see that I have all these roles. So this is the application that has been authenticated now. And you can see there are no user information. There's no Jan Vidar at Elven no or something, because now the application has been authenticating as itself. So the audience is still the C90, this is the API, but now I have a different setup. So perfect. If I want to go into the API again, you can see that I have managed application in local directory. So if I click on that API, I have now an enterprise application. And this enterprise application can be used for conditional access scenarios. You can require MFA. I can go in and say users and groups, and I can let, this is the applications that are represented now, but I can add a user or group and say that, for example, oh, this was slow. This was very slow. One more time. Let's see. Users and groups. Add users and groups. Oh, here it is. So I can, for example, say that Elven. So I have this Elven user, for example, and I can assign a role. And now I can say that this guy Elven, he can he is allowed to read all temporary access paths, for example. So now I can assign a role as well. And if I do that, then you can see I can assign different roles as well. So I now have a scenario where I can have a user that not only can require request scopes for delegated permissions, but they can also be assigned roles automatically. So if I now go back to this scenario here and go and select authorization code flow, and I will get back to using the variables for client ID. Oh, sorry, just a little lag here. There we are. And client secret. Oh. There we are. And if I now select, for example, read again, I can even add, just to have some difference, let's add hide to read as well. And then I can click get new access token. Signing in with my user. And now you can see that I also have to consent the new FIDO2 methods, but because I haven't consented to that before. Yeah. And then we get a new access token. And what I will show you now is if I click use token and copy that, there we are. I can go and look at that token. Oh, come on. Oh, here we are. So you can see now I have the following scopes. I have phone read and FIDO2 read, but I've also been assigned an application role. So now this role can also be looked at when I do some inside authorization. All right. So we have some summarizing points. I think, and hopefully many of you have been working with serverless APIs, either logic apps or function apps from before. So my main topic for today was to show how you can build the behinds of APIs and authorization scenarios. And now the next part is implementing that in serverless APIs. So let's get that presentation up. So serverless API authentication and authorization. You can use two approaches. You can use one or both. What I mean is that by authentication, this is pre-auth. You will require that users are authenticated before they can do anything against your serverless APIs. So for example, if you are using Logic App, you can create an authorization policy, or in function apps, you can use the Azure AD integration called EasyAuth, so you can apply authentication directly to the function app. If you do that, you need to set up a requiring matching issuer and audience. Using pre-auth, your logic app or function app will never trigger if the users are not authenticated and have the correct authorization audience. So that's basically a better way to do it, because if users are not authenticated, they will never trigger and you will not consume resources in your environment. The other way is you do authorization checks inside. So this is after the function app or the logic app has been triggered. Then you go and check the claims. So you can receive the access token, you can check the claims, and you can do some custom response handling inside. In this case, the function app or the logic app will always trigger anyway, but you need to provide some logic inside to really determine what users can receive back or not. I would suggest that you use both. You have to have pre-authentication to protect on the front door, and then you can do some inside auth as well. So for pre-auth, if you go to logic apps, you have something called authorization policies. In the logic apps and the authorization policies, there you can define a policy name, and then you will at least need to set up an issuer. And the issuer is always sts.windows.net and the tenant ID. And this is if you are using version 1.0 tokens. So access tokens, they are in two versions. They are version 1 and version 2. And you can set that in the manifest in your API. So use accepted token version, either 1 or 2. So if you don't do anything, it will always be version 1, but you can go in and set 2 in the manifest, and then it will provide the version 2 for, tokens. And then you specify an audience, and the audience is the API colon 11 logic app API in this case. Or if you are using version 2 tokens, then you need to specify the application ID of the API. So it will look like this. So if you're using version 2.0 tokens, then you need to have the issuer to be login microsoftonline.com and the tenant ID, and then it will be appended by version 2.0. You don't see it here. And the audience will be the app ID of that API. So you have to use one or the other of these, and this is for logic apps. For Azure Functions, then you will go into App Service Authentication, and you set that to on, and you go and say that if users are not authenticated, they need to log in with Azure Active Directory. And then you can go and specify the issuer and audience as well there. There's also a new authentication preview now available for function apps. So you can add providers. It's currently only supporting Microsoft, but it's a different setup experience. And if you enable this experience, you cannot go back to the EasyAuth, the old one. So just a little warning there. So in logic apps, how do you include the authorization header? In function apps, it's already there, but if you are running logic apps and you have an incoming HTTP request, then you need to have operation options include authorization headers in output. And then you can go and decode that token. It's coming in base64 format, so you need to kind of go and do all the JVT details and get all the information. There are some complex functions you need to run here. I will have a resource for you at the end where I have written a blog post about this, so that might be handy to look at. In Azure Functions, tokens will automatically be supplied in the request and authorization header, so you just need to get it. So you can go in and get the authorization header, and then you can do a split because it will always say bearer and the space, and then comes the token. So you need to get that second part, and then you can then you can go and decode that token. You can decode base64 yourself, or you can get a PowerShell gallery module, for example, like JVT details. And if you include that, you can go and just get all the claims directly. So that's somebody has called Darren Robinson. He has created a very nice little function that will get all the details from the access token. So and this means that when I have a function app like this or a logic app, I can let that call another API. And that's the really logic, because if your serverless API can send requests to other APIs, you can have the logic obscured from the users. So users, they can call the logic app or function app, but you can let the logic app or function app call other APIs like Azure REST APIs or Graph or something. And for that, you will use the managed identity for application permissions. So you can let the serverless function or logic app do that on behalf of the user. And using managed service identity, you can have give them Azure RBAC role assignments, build custom roles wherever possible. It's a good practice. Or you can have give Microsoft Graph permissions to that service principal. You can do that using Azure AD PowerShell only today. I have a script that will show you that how you can do that. So finishing up on that demo here, we are actually 1 minute over time. I had so much on my heart today. So let's finish up. I will do a quick check here, and this is a check from Azure Function. This will be available on my GitHub, so you can see it yourself there. So I'm getting the authorization check here, and I will. This is just for debugging. I write out all the scopes and roles, and then I can look into, okay, if the scope or the roles is not matching some claims, I can say, hey, you're not forbidden, you're not authorized. And then I can go in and do the really exciting details, because if I'm using managed service identity, I can get a graph access token, and I can use a function app to be able to call over to the graph on behalf of the user. So in this example, I will connect using Graph SDK, and I will get, for example, if the user's scope matches phone read, then you can get all the user phone methods. And I haven't done all the other variants, but then you can also do other checks, like if the users match FIDO read, get FIDO methods. If the user match email read, get email methods, and so on. So this is on my GitHub repository. You can see it there. And also, as I see on my closing here, so I have written a series of blog posts on logic apps and protecting. So here you can see a complete scenario and also how you can connect to that logic app using Power Platform. And it's quite similar for Azure Functions. But this is a continuing series, so I would advise you to look up on that. So this is the GitHub repository. You will easily find it by going to GitHub and Jan Vidar Elven, and then you have Protect Azure Serverless with Azure AD as a public repository. And also, if you are new to Identity Platform and OAuth, these are some great resources for that. I will have a PDF of this presentation with those links. I can upload that directly to the team in the chat here now after this session. So I think that's that. Sorry for the minutes over the time, but
wow, thank you, Jan. The sessions keep on getting better and better. So I have to say, I was really impressed. I'm a big fan of yours. It was a really great session. That was highly relevant. Often gets missed out on many implementations. So you really are plugging in the gap. You really are taking the community of Azure and Power Platform consultants to the next level now by considering these techniques to provide that granular level of security. So thank you so much for improving the levels for the community globally. So thanks for that. That's really valuable session, Jan. Do you have any final comments before you leave?
Yeah. Also, this is, as you can see, this is a workshop material. We can do this for hours and really cover a lot of scenarios. So if something comes by and an opportunity to do that, I will be interested in doing that at a later time, because
sounds great.
we really need some more time, and then we can do really demos and people can follow along with their own code and so on. I think that's a good fit for this. But this is just to show the possibilities, but it's very interesting to explore those authentication scenarios with serverless, because more and more people are using serverless for automation.
Well, there you go. That was Jan. So Jan, please share your contact details. I'm sure many people want to keep in touch with you. We'll definitely keep in contact with you. Doing some fantastic work there, Jan. So well done. Thanks for that. So that was Jan, guys. So Jan's going to share his contact details in the chat.
Yeah.
Feel free to connect with him, please. That'd be great. Okay. So next up, we have Joel Rodriguez.
Yep.
Hello, Joel. We can hear you. We can hear you, Joel.